Welcome to another episode of Tell Me Another, a podcast dedicated to telling great stories from the past, stories of genius and folly, compassion and cruelty. Instead of sitting around a campfire telling stories of our ancestors, we're coming to you from the History Department of the U.S. Naval Academy, located in Annapolis, Maryland. We're coming with stories to tell, and we hope you will listen. With us in the studio today is Associate Professors Molly Lester and Thomas Burgess, as well as Assistant Professor Nicholas Cross, who will be telling one of the most remarkable stories of the ancient Mediterranean world, which Dr. Cross is calling provocatively, You Only Live Twice, Alcibiades, the Athenian 007. Take it away, Nicholas.
Thank you. In the early 1960s, John Lennon would give his Beatles bandmates pep talks by asking, "Where are we going, fellas?" The others would reply, "To the toppermost of the poppermost, Johnny." That kind of ambition, along with charisma, talent, and good luck, would result in the global phenomena of Beatlemania. Likewise, a consuming passion for success drove the ancient Athenian Alcibiades to reach the pinnacle of power in Athens and led to a similar mania among his contemporaries. The first period of his life, from childhood to the Sicilian expedition in 415, is characterized by his ambition. The second period of his life, from 415 to his death in 404, which the second episode of this series covers, is one of the most eventful in all of history, as he tried to reach the toppermost of the poppermost. From his birth in the mid-5th century BCE, Alcibiades was marked for greatness. His family was the prominent Alcmeonidae. His mother was the granddaughter of Cleisthenes, the lawgiver who introduced democracy to Athens in 508 BCE. After his father died in a battle in 447, the upbringing of young Alcibiades was left to his cousin, Pericles, the great statesman of the Athenian democracy. But Pericles was not an interested guardian. The ancient biographer Plutarch mentions a story in which Alcibiades asked for time with Pericles, but was told that he was too busy working on the state's finances. As a result, the boy, seeking attention, became a little rascal, marching to the beat of his own drum. Plutarch records an anecdote in which Alcibiades, while playing jacks in the street with his friends, would not move out of the way of an approaching wagon. The other boys scattered, but he laid down and stretched himself out across the road, forcing the driver to stop his horses. Loath to conform, Alcibiades fancied himself a trendsetter. At school, he refused to play the aulos, a flute, though it was an instrument of choice for young Athenians at the time, saying that it made the player's face look ridiculous. Instead, he played the lyre, and in so doing influenced the rest of his classmates to take up that instrument as well. Almost overnight, the aulos went out of fashion and was dropped from the school curriculum. Early on, Alcibiades recognized that he could be a leader. For all his faults as a guardian, Pericles did well in introducing Alcibiades to Socrates, the famous philosopher. At first, teacher and student turned out to be compatible. Socrates, too, refused to be constrained by convention, and had already made a name for himself as a provocative philosopher. The two studied together, trained together, and went on campaign together. In 432, when Alcibiades was 18 years old, the first year in which he was eligible for military service, they fought together at the Battle of Potidaea in northern Greece. During the fighting, Alcibiades was wounded, but his teacher saved his life. Afterwards, the Athenian victors chose to confer on Socrates the prize of valor, but the philosopher convinced them to award it instead to Alcibiades for his own bravery in the battle. Alcibiades returned that favor 8 years later at the Battle of Delium. At a point when the Boeotian enemy broke through the Athenian line, Alcibiades, on horseback, noticed his teacher, on foot, retreating. Alcibiades rode alongside him and saw him safely out of the reach of the enemy. As Alcibiades grew into manhood, he also became more licentious. Socrates hoped that his student would go beyond his ambitions for personal glory and seek after virtue, but it was to no avail. Far from corrupting the youth, as was the charge placed against the philosopher in his famous trial, he tried but failed to improve the young man morally. Sometimes, comments Plutarch, Alcibiades would surrender himself to the flatterers who tempted him with many pleasures, and slip away from Socrates and suffer himself to be actually hunted down by him like a runaway slave. And yet he feared and reverenced Socrates alone and despised the rest of his lovers. Plato, another student of Socrates, comments on how Alcibiades respected, even loved the older man. He includes Alcibiades in his Symposium, set sometime around 416. In the dialogue, Alcibiades, drunk, extols Socrates' exceptional rectitude and wisdom and admits that he is sexually attracted to his teacher. But Socrates had no interest in sensual pleasures and opulence, and as for Alcibiades, he was more interested in being a philanderer than a philosopher. At any rate, he recognized that virtue was not a necessity in the Athenian democracy. Alcibiades entered political life by chance and by seizing the moment, as was the case of much of his eventful life. The story was told that while passing by the Pnyx, the open-air meeting place of the assembly, he heard great applause for those who were contributing money to the state. Jealous for that same approval, he walked into the assembly and contributed enough to garner the praise of his fellow citizens. He basked in the glory of public approval.
What an amazing setup for the story, Nicholas. I'm just curious to know if there are other influences upon Alcibiades aside from Pericles and Socrates. Did he read Homer, for example? Was he inspired by the lives of the great heroes of Greek legend, Achilles and Agamemnon? Did he want to follow in their footsteps and be also an immortal Greek hero of legend?
Yeah, undoubtedly he knew the heroes of the Greek past, as you mentioned, Achilles and Hercules and others, and would want to emulate them. Alcibiades, like all Athenian young men, would have known the stories of Homer and Hesiod and others. There may be another influence that is more practical for Alcibiades, and that's a new group of teachers in Athens called sophists. In the mid-5th century, Athens was becoming a cultural center, a political center, an economic center, and lots of migrants were moving to Athens and its port at Piraeus. Many of those were teachers. Sophists, however, taught for money. So it was usually wealthy young men who could afford to pay for this kind of education. And Sophist curriculum was very relativistic. Truth wasn't really important. Rather, how to use oratory and rhetoric in order to get a position in the Athenian democracy. And this, I think, is a great influence on Alcibiades, who, as we'll see, also had very little interest in truth or what is virtue, but rather, how can I acquire more power?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nick. And that actually leads into my question. In many ways, this is not exactly a flattering portrait of Alcibiades, that he's not interested in virtue, especially as the sophists are not concerned with what's right, but they're concerned with winning. And this leads me to his biographer, Plutarch. Now, as you well know, when Plutarch, the Roman historian, writes his biographies, he pairs them because he thinks that these two historical figures will comment on each other. So my question to you is, who does Plutarch pair with Alcibiades, and how does that reflect on Alcibiades?
That's a good question. Plutarch wrote these biographies of great Greek men and Roman men and would pair them, as you said. Plutarch pairs Alcibiades with the Roman Coriolanus. Coriolanus was also an exile, as we'll see Alcibiades was. Coriolanus also worked for the other side, as it were, the Volsci, and attacked Rome. But Plutarch isn't against seeing the positive features of these individuals as well. When he compares the two, he acknowledges that both Alcibiades and Coriolanus were daring in their own individual pursuits. He also admits that they were great commanders. But Plutarch also shows that we can learn lessons through the failures of these individuals. And so he pairs these two, but he shows both their impressive features as well as those that he would like his readers to avoid.
That is really an interesting approach to biography.
Alcibiades came of age during the opening phase of the Peloponnesian War. In 421, he turned 30, the earliest possible age to be a general. He had dreams of leading the Athenians in a great victory over the Spartan enemy. But in that same year, a man named Nicias negotiated a peace treaty with the Spartans, thereby robbing Alcibiades of his dream. To make a greater name for himself, he would have to find some way to rekindle the war. That opportunity presented itself in 416 when the Athenians were approached about an expedition to Sicily, hundreds of miles to the west. Egesta, a non-Greek city in western Sicily and an ally of the Athenians, had come into conflict with nearby Selinus. When the latter reached out for support from Syracuse, the principal Greek city on Sicily, Egesta appealed for help from Athens on the basis of their alliance and even offered to finance the expedition. Alcibiades salivated at the prospects. But some Athenians were hesitant to get involved in a distant quarrel. A considerable portion of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War is taken up with the debates for and against this expedition. Nicias, as expected, was against it, arguing that it would overextend their resources and endanger the peace. But Alcibiades, who held out promises that the mission would be simple, swift, and rewarding, was more persuasive. The enthusiastic assembly voted to send a huge fleet consisting of over 100 ships and their crews numbering over 20,000 men. They appointed 3 generals to be in command: Alcibiades, his rival Nicias, who, it was thought, would check Alcibiades' rashness, and a third named Lamachus, an experienced leader who could break any deadlock between the two celebrity generals. Preparing the Grand Fleet was a major undertaking. On one night, in the midst of those preparations, someone mutilated the faces of Hermes, stone statues of the god Hermes that stood in the doorways of homes and temples. Since the messenger god oversaw travel, the incident was interpreted as an evil omen and jeopardized the future of the expedition. An investigation was immediately opened. A political enemy of Alcibiades produced false witnesses who claimed that they saw Alcibiades and his friends mutilate the Hermes. The witnesses also raised an anecdote of one night in the past when an inebriated Alcibiades played the part of the high priest in a mock celebration of the Eleusinian mysteries, the religious rites that initiates were forbidden to reveal upon the pain of death. The implication was that these kinds of impious acts were characteristic of Alcibiades, and that he therefore must be guilty of the desecration of the Herms as well. No one seemed to ask why he, enthusiastic about the Sicilian expedition, would try to jeopardize it in such a way. If anyone should be suspected of trying to prevent the mission, it was Nicias, not Alcibiades. But there was not enough to convict him. Alcibiades, confident in his innocence in this particular, demanded to be tried before the expedition set sail. His enemies, however, knew that the men of the fleet were infatuated with Alcibiades and would demand his acquittal. Instead, they postponed the trial and accelerated the expedition, hoping to gather more evidence and recall Alcibiades while the fleet was away in Sicily. When the Athenians arrived in southern Italy en route to Sicily, they discovered to their horror that their Aegistan allies had exaggerated their ability to support the fleet. Nicias advised a quick attack against Aegisthus' enemy Silenus, and then return home. Alcibiades, however, proposed that since they had come all this way, they should find new allies who could support the fleet and bolster their forces. Lamachus backed Alcibiades, whose plan, with the votes of 2 out of the 3 generals, won out. While following this revised plan, the fleet sailed to Catana, on the east coast of Sicily, and secured its cooperation. While there, however, a ship arrived from Athens to take Alcibiades home to stand trial. The investigation into the mutilation of the Herms had continued, and had concluded that Alcibiades should be condemned. He left Sicily in his own ship, but he had no intention of returning to Athens. At Thurii, in southern Italy, he abandoned his ship and found a merchant ship that carried him to the Peloponnesus, where he found his way to Sparta, of all places. When the Athenians learned of his desertion, they condemned him to death. Alcibiades' prospects were bleak. All that he had worked for throughout his life seemed to be out of his grasp. But he was not deterred. The ambitious youth turned audacious man would find a way to return home, and when he did, it would be at the toppermost of the poppermost.
Yeah, at the toppermost, but at the expense of the Athenian fleet in Sicily, perhaps. And this really brings me to think about Alcibiades' self-interest and his status as an Athenian citizen. Now, as a citizen, presumably you're supposed to put the well-being of the state before yourself. So I want your thoughts, Nick, on was Alcibiades a good Athenian citizen? Did he care about the fate of the city at all?
Oh, that's a great question, Molly. The ancient authors would say no. Plutarch comments how Alcibiades is able to be an Athenian at one moment. He could then be a Spartan, as we'll see at another moment. He then spends time with Persia. He's not tied to Athens except as it works to his own advantage. That said, in this particular case, his own city has turned against him. Mm-hmm. Alcibiades is a political person. He's also a divisive character. He's got a huge following, and this is a threat to his political rivals. So the fact that he turns away from Athens, I'm not sure what else he could have done.
I see.
There are other exiles in Athenian history. This is what you need to do. You leave Athens. No, I don't think he's a model of patriotism. But in this particular instance, I don't think I can fault him for at least going to Sparta. Now, what he will do in the next episode may be more damning.
Nicholas, I guess I'm just struck by how ill-fated an expedition this was. You have two generals, one of whom is in a cloud of scandal about to be recalled, and the other one opposed to the expedition from the get-go. What could possibly go wrong? And so why didn't the Athenians see the writing on the wall? Why didn't they just give up and go home? Were they suffering from overconfidence as a people or as a military culture?
Yeah, definitely suffering from overconfidence as a military culture, but also, dare I say, as a democracy. Perhaps we've seen some of these in our own history, this overconfidence, or as the Greeks would say, hubris. It's important to know these sources for the Sicilian expedition. The principal one is Thucydides. Thucydides writes, of course, the history of the entire Peloponnesian War while he himself is in exile. Thucydides really admired Pericles. He thought Pericles had the right kind of strategy to win the Peloponnesian War. But by the time of the Sicilian expedition, the time of Alcibiades' height, Pericles has long been dead. And to Thucydides, in exile from Athens, he saw the successors to Pericles leading Athens in the wrong direction. This is not the way to win the war. So, in a way, the account of the Sicilian expedition is Thucydides' narrative way of critiquing the Athenian democracy.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Tell Me Another, and join us next time as Dr. Cross relates the amazing tale of Alcibiades, when the years to come would burn a trail of intrigue, betrayal, triumph, and revenge across the ancient Mediterranean.